A geopolitical earthquake has just occurred. I mean, if you are anywhere near a television, a smartphone, or a radio right now, you already know the headline.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It really is. It is the kind of breaking news that genuinely shifts the axis of global politics. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, has been killed in a joint U.S.-Israeli military airstrike.
Right.
Overnight, the entire landscape of the Middle East and, frankly, the geopolitical calculus of the entire world has fundamentally altered. There is a massive power vacuum, and right now, information is just flying in every possible direction.
It is a moment of profound uncertainty. And I think the challenge with a breaking event of this magnitude is that the immediate military action, the strike itself, it tends to consume all the oxygen in the room.
Totally.
But to actually understand what this means for the future, we have to look far beyond the decisions made in Washington or Tel Aviv. We have to look at the ground reality in Iran. We are talking about a nation of 93 million people who have spent decades navigating severe economic realities, deeply entrenched political factions, and a suppressed cultural identity that is now suddenly bubbling to the absolute surface.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to cut through that 24-hour news cycle noise. We are not just going to read you the headlines. We want to understand the multi-layered reality of what is happening inside Iran right now.
Yeah, the real context.
Right. And to do that, we are leaning heavily on a remarkably detailed interview from the Dutch channel De Nieuwe Wereld. Journalist Jasper van Dijk sat down with Saifa Eskandari. She's an Iranian Dutch activist. And what makes this conversation so vital is that it completely bridges the gap between high-level geopolitics and raw, lived human experience.
It really grounds the whole situation.
It does. We are going to explore the immediate aftermath of the strike, the brutal economic realities that paved the way for this moment, the incredibly fragmented opposition groups vying for power, and what all of this actually means for the Iranian people. Whether you are a dedicated follower of international relations or you are simply trying to make sense of the alerts popping up on your phone, you are in the right place to get the context you need.
Before we dive into that context, it is crucial that we set a very clear framework for our discussion today. We are going to be analyzing highly sensitive, volatile events.
Very sensitive.
Right. This includes discussing targeted military airstrikes directed by figures like Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as deeply entrenched internal political divisions, decades of domestic policy within Iran, and a long history of Western intelligence operations in the Middle East.
It's a lot of heavy material.
It is. And I want to be entirely clear with you. Our objective today is strictly analytical. We are synthesizing the facts, the historical timelines, and the perspectives presented in our materials to help you understand the dynamics at play.
We're not picking sides here.
Exactly. We are not endorsing any specific political viewpoint, any military action, any opposition faction, or any government policy, whether from the West or from within the Middle East. Our goal is impartially mapping out the board so you can understand the pieces that are currently in motion.
Exactly. We are just here to help you navigate the complexity. So I want to start by looking at the immediate ground-level reality of this strike, because we see the satellite imagery in the press conferences, but what does it actually look like for an Iranian family when something like this happens?
It's terrifying.
It is. Saifa Eskandari paints a vivid picture of the morning the news broke. Imagine waking up in the Netherlands, picking up your phone, and the very first thing you see is a WhatsApp message from your aunt back in Tehran.
Yeah.
And the message simply says, Tehran is under attack. There is a high chance we will lose internet and phone connections again. Don't worry.
The phrase "don't worry" in that context is incredibly jarring.
Right.
It speaks to a deeply conditioned resilience. For the diaspora, the millions of Iranians living in Europe, North America, and elsewhere, this triggers an immediate, visceral panic because they know exactly what follows that message.
Blackout.
Exactly. The state possesses the infrastructure to essentially flip a switch and isolate the country digitally. They have spent years developing what is often called the National Information Network. It's a localized intranet designed precisely for moments of crisis.
So they can just cut the cord to the outside world.
Yes, it allows essential domestic services to function while entirely cutting off access to the global internet, WhatsApp, Instagram, and any outbound communication.
And that is exactly what happened. By 9:00 a.m., there was a total communications blackout. So you have people living thousands of miles away, frantically dialing their parents, their siblings, their cousins, and getting absolutely nothing, just dead air.
It's an agonizing wait.
But eventually, a trickle of information always manages to make it out. People find workarounds, they use specialized VPNs, they smuggle video files to contacts across the border. And when those fragmented videos started leaking out to the rest of the world, the contrast was staggering.
It really was.
On one hand, you have families gripped by the sheer terror of not knowing if their loved ones are alive. And on the other hand, the videos showed Iranians literally dancing in the streets.
It is a profound psychological dichotomy. You are seeing the physical manifestation of a population caught squarely between intense pain and sudden, unexpected hope.
Yeah.
The man who sat at the absolute apex of the system that has governed their lives, dictated their social behavior, and managed their economy for over 3 decades is suddenly gone.
Just gone overnight.
Right. For many on those streets, it represents the potential end of an era that has been defined by strict systemic control. But dancing in the streets in that environment carries an immense calculated risk.
Because the security forces are still there.
Exactly. The state apparatus, the security forces, are still very much present. To step out and celebrate in plain view of those forces requires a level of desperation and release that is difficult to overstate.
That brings up a massive question for me. Why would ordinary people, people with families and jobs, risk everything to celebrate in the streets when the military and security forces are still actively patrolling?
It's a crucial question.
We tend to view everything happening in the Middle East through the lens of ideology or religion. But looking at the breakdown of the situation, the true catalyst that pushed the broader population to the absolute brink wasn't just political theory. It was raw, unadulterated economic desperation.
What's fascinating here is how often the economic realities are overshadowed by the geopolitical headlines.
Right, we always focus on the nukes or the rhetoric.
Yes, but if you want to understand the mobilization of the Iranian working class, the people who aren't necessarily political activists, but who have formed the backbone of the recent unrest, you have to look at the grocery store, not just the parliament.
Wow.
The material conditions over the last few years have deteriorated into severe hyperinflation. The currency, the rial, has plummeted in value to an extent that completely erases the purchasing power of an average salary.
Let's put some real numbers to that, because the examples given in the interview are just staggering. We are not talking about a 10% or 20% spike in inflation, which is painful enough.
No, it's much worse.
We are talking about a scenario where a basic standard box of eggs costs the equivalent of 40 euro.
Yes.
A small cut of chicken, just a basic piece of poultry, costs 70 euro. How does a society even function when basic protein becomes a luxury item?
It doesn't function. It fractures. When the mathematical reality of daily life means that a full month's wages from a working-class job cannot feed a family for a week, the fundamental social contract between the governed and the governing completely dissolves.
That makes total sense.
Fear is a powerful deterrent, but starvation is a far more powerful motivator. When a father or a mother goes to the bazaar with stacks of nearly worthless currency and realizes they cannot afford to buy a single piece of chicken for their children, the fear of the security forces is eclipsed by the immediate existential threat of poverty.
It's survival at that point.
Exactly. That is the boiling point. The ideological grievances are deeply real, but the economic collapse was the spark that ignited the wider population.
And that spark set off a chain reaction that leads us into a timeline of staggering, almost incomprehensible human cost. Because when those desperate people took to the streets over the past year, the response they met was not a negotiation about economic policy.
Yeah, it was a crackdown.
It was industrial-scale violence. We need to look closely at the events that escalated from late 2025 straight through into January of 2026.
The data emerging from this period points to an extraordinarily intense mobilization by the state's security apparatus. The protests reached a fever pitch around the first week of January 2026. The estimated casualties from this specific wave of unrest are vast. Reports indicate that anywhere from 20,000 to 40,000 people were killed in street-level clashes and crackdowns.
That's just...
Furthermore, an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 individuals were arrested, swept up from the streets in their homes, and placed into the state's prison system.
Wait, I have to pause on those numbers. 20,000 to 40,000 dead in a matter of months. And it wasn't just the chaos of street protests. There is a specific detail about the judicial response that is chilling. In the month of January alone, the state carried out 558 executions.
Yes.
That is nearly 20 people hanged every single day for a month.
The judicial executions serve a distinct purpose from the street-level crowd control. They are designed to send a highly visible, permanent message regarding the consequences of dissent.
A deterrent.
Exactly. But the tactics used on the streets themselves were equally intended to maximize deterrence. There is an account of a specific incident that perfectly illustrates the nature of the confrontation.
I know exactly the incident you mean, and it is horrifying. There is verified video footage of 3 snipers positioned on a rooftop above a crowd of everyday citizens.
Right.
And in the span of exactly 6 minutes, those 3 shooters fired between 200 and 600 rounds directly into the people below, up to 100 bullets a minute, raining down on a street. I mean, who is pulling the trigger in a situation like that?
In operations of that nature, you were generally looking at the specialized security forces, most notably the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or their associated paramilitary volunteer militia known as the Basij.
Okay, the IRGC, we hear that a lot.
It is important to understand what the IRGC actually is. They are not just the regular armed forces, which are known as the Artesh and are tasked with defending the physical borders of the country.
Right, they have a different job.
Exactly. The IRGC was created specifically after the 1979 revolution with one primary mandate: to protect the systemic and ideological integrity of the republic itself from internal and external threats.
So their entire job description is to ensure the survival of the governing system, whatever the cost.
Exactly. And over the decades, the IRGC has grown into an entity that is deeply woven into the fabric of the nation. Think of them almost as a massive armed corporate conglomerate.
A corporation with an army.
Yes. They have deep interests in the telecommunications sector, massive construction and engineering projects, and significant control over border logistics and ports. Because they're so entrenched economically and politically, any threat to the system is a direct threat to their vast empire.
So they have everything to lose.
That is why the response to widespread unrest is so highly organized and intensely kinetic.
But when you have a security apparatus applying that level of kinetic force, when people are dying by the hundreds every single day, what does that actually do to the psyche of the country? There is a really profound point made in the interview about how this level of casualty interacted with the cultural traditions of the Iranian people.
This is where we see the intersection of state action and cultural tradition, creating a deeply unique psychological environment. In Shia Islamic tradition, the grieving process has very specific communal milestones.
Right.
When someone passes away, the family and community gather for intense mourning on the 7th day after the death and then again on the 40th day. These are major events of remembrance and sorrow.
Right, but normally those are isolated events for a single family. But if 20,000 people are killed over a few months, those days start to stack up.
Precisely. Because the casualties were occurring continuously, daily, the calendar itself became a relentless, overlapping cycle of grief. On any given Tuesday, a neighborhood might be observing the 7th day for one young man, while simultaneously observing the 40th day for a woman down the street.
It just never ends.
The following Wednesday, the cycle repeats for different families. The entire nation became trapped in an unbroken loop of mourning. The digital landscape reflected this entirely. If you looked at the social media feeds of young Iranians during this period, all elements of normal everyday life, sharing a meal, a joke, a graduation, vanished.
The joy was just gone.
Completely. The collective consciousness was entirely consumed by the logistic and the emotional weight of processing death.
You cannot sustain a society in a state of perpetual mourning. Something eventually has to give. And it's crucial to point out that this specific wave of violence in 2025 and 2026 wasn't some isolated historical anomaly.
No, not at all.
It was simply the latest, most intense chapter in a struggle that has been going on for generations. If we trace the timeline backward, you see these massive historical flashpoints where the pressure cooker just exploded.
If we look back just a few years to September 2022, we find one of the most significant cultural flashpoints in modern Iranian history. The catalyst was the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman.
Right. This made global headlines.
Yes. She was detained in Tehran by the Guidance Patrol, commonly referred to in the West as the Morality Police.
And her detainment was over something incredibly trivial, right? It wasn't a political demonstration. It was an accusation that she was wearing her hijab improperly, that a few locks of hair were visible.
Yes. She died in state custody shortly after her arrest under highly disputed and deeply suspicious circumstances. Her death struck a profound nerve across demographic lines, sparking the woman life freedom movement.
That was massive.
It was. This was a movement largely led by young women, challenging the most visible symbols of systemic control. But if you step back even further, to November 2019, you see a precursor to the economic protests we just discussed.
Ah, the fuel protest.
Exactly. In 2019, a sudden, massive hike in fuel prices triggered nationwide demonstrations. In response, over the course of just a few days, an estimated 1,500 to potentially thousands of individuals were killed in the resulting crackdown.
And going back another decade, you have 2009, the Green Movement. This was driven by the deeply contested presidential election results, where Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was declared the winner over more moderate candidates.
Millions were on the streets.
Millions of people poured into the streets of Tehran asking one simple question: where is my vote? And that is when the world witnessed the death of Nida Aga Sultan, a young woman who was shot on the street, and her final moments were captured on a cell phone camera and broadcast globally.
And if we trace this bloodline all the way back to the foundational years of the current system, we arrive at 1988.
That was a dark year.
Extremely.
Yeah.
In the summer of that year, at the conclusion of the devastating Iran-Iraq War, the state systematically executed thousands of political prisoners. These were individuals already serving sentences for their affiliations with various leftist and opposition groups.
So this is a recurring cycle.
Yes. So when we analyze the reactions today, the dancing, the panic, the chaos, we're looking at the culmination of nearly 50 years of accumulated multi-generational trauma. There's practically no family network in Iran that hasn't been directly touched by this historical timeline of violence and imprisonment.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because it's so easy for us to sit here and list off these massive numbers, 20,000 dead, massive protests, historical dates, and lose sight of the actual human beings living inside those statistics.
Absolutely.
But the story of Asef's parents grounds this entire geopolitical history in a narrative that is almost unbelievable. It sounds like something out of a novel, a literal love story born inside a political prison during one of the darkest periods in modern Iranian history.
To understand their story, we have to look closely at the political climate of the 1980s. Following the 1979 revolution, the system of governance transitioned to a strict clerical structure, often referred to as the rule of the mullahs.
Let me stop you right there. We hear the term mullah all the time in the news, but what does it actually mean in this context?
A mullah is essentially an Islamic cleric, someone educated in Islamic theology and sacred law. In the context of Iran's post-1979 political system, the concept of velayat-i faqih, or the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, was implemented.
Okay.
This meant that the highest religious authorities were granted the ultimate political and legal authority over the state. So, when people refer to the mullah regime, they are describing a government where the ultimate power rests not with elected civil servants, but with the senior clerical establishment.
Yeah, that makes sense.
In the 1980s, this newly established clerical government moved swiftly to eliminate rival political factions that had originally participated in the revolution against the Shah.
And that is exactly how Asif's parents ended up in prison. They were young activists who opposed this new clerical consolidation of power. Just think about this. Her mother was only 16 years old, a high schooler.
A child, really.
Yeah. Her father was 19. Both of them were swept up by the authorities and thrown into political prison. And initially, both of them were handed death sentences simply for their political beliefs, which were later eventually commuted to long-term multi-year sentences.
Right.
But here's the incredible part. They were locked in the same prison facility, but they were kept completely segregated. They had never laid eyes on each other, yet they managed to fall in love.
It is a remarkable testament to human connection under conditions of extreme sensory and emotional deprivation. Her father, isolated in his cell block, could hear the voice of a young woman shouting and protesting through the thick prison walls.
What's her voice?
He didn't know what she looked like, but he heard her sheer defiance. He was deeply moved by the strength and conviction in her voice alone. As it happened, her two brothers were incarcerated in the exact same cell block as him.
Wow, what a coincidence.
Over time, communicating covertly, he realized the voice belonged to their sister.
Yeah.
And based entirely on the spirit he heard echoing through the walls, he told her brothers that when they were finally free, he was going to marry her.
And he actually did it. They survived years in that environment. In the mid-1980s, they were finally released, but it came with a very strict, terrifying condition. They were ordered to completely abandon any form of political activism. If they stepped out of line again, the consequences would be final.
The commuted death sentences would be reinstated.
Exactly. But the very day they were released, her father looked at her mother and said, "I am going to keep fighting this system until the day I drop dead. Are you with me?" And she said yes.
Incredible bravery.
But as the executions of 1988 started ramping up, they realized that having a young family, Asefa was just a baby at this point, wasn't going to protect them. So in 1987, they made the agonizing decision to flee. They smuggled themselves out of Iran, traveling through Baghdad, crossing into Turkey, and eventually undertaking the long journey to claim asylum in the Netherlands.
They managed to escape the physical borders of the country and build a new life in Europe. But one of the most crucial elements to understand about the intelligence apparatus of this system is what is frequently called the long arm of Tehran.
The long arm, yeah.
Escaping the geography of Iran does not equate to escaping the surveillance or the influence of its security services. And Asefa's own life provides a chilling example of this reality, bringing us to a deeply unsettling incident in the year 2003.
Right. So in 2003, Asefa is 14 years old. She's a teenager growing up in the Netherlands. But the geopolitical climate in Europe at that time was incredibly tense. It was just a couple of years after the September 11th attacks.
Yes.
She talks about facing severe discrimination, walking down the street in a European city, and being called a terrorist, entirely based on her Middle Eastern background. She was experiencing a massive identity crisis.
Very common for diaspora youth at that time.
Exactly. She felt this desperate, overwhelming need to connect with her roots, to understand where she came from, and to see her extended family. She mentions having something like 20 aunts and uncles still living in Iran. So as a 14-year-old Dutch citizen, she travels back to Iran to visit them.
A completely understandable journey of adolescent self-discovery. However, because her parents had continued their vocal political activism from exile in Europe, the Iranian intelligence services maintained a very detailed dossier on their family.
They were tracking them.
They were acutely aware that the 14-year-old daughter of high-profile dissidents had just entered the country. They did not ignore this. Instead, they orchestrated a deeply psychological intervention. They invited this young teenager to a formal dinner.
Just imagine the intimidation factor there. A group of seasoned intelligence officers sitting across a dinner table from a 14-year-old girl, and they didn't mince words. They delivered a very precise, terrifying message.
What did they say?
They told her that she needed to get on an airplane, fly back to the Netherlands, and instruct her parents to immediately cease all of their political activities. And when she asked what would happen if they refused, the officers looked at her and said, "The next time you visit Iran, we won't bring you in because of who you are. We will bring you in because of who your parents are."
Chilling.
They were explicitly threatening to activate the old commuted death sentences of her parents, and they were using a child as the messenger.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this specific type of psychological warfare, the pervasive, inescapable knowledge that the state is always watching and willing to leverage your family against you, forces an entire society into a profound long-term psychological adaptation.
Right.
In sociological terms, navigating this environment requires a structural fragmentation of identity. To survive, the Iranian people have been forced over 3 generations to cultivate what is often described as two faces.
Let's really dig into that concept of the two faces, because to me, that is the most fascinating and heartbreaking insight of this entire situation. We aren't just talking about keeping a secret, we're talking about a systemic way of existing.
Exactly. The historical and sociological parallel here is often linked to the concept of taqiyya, or ketman, the practice of concealing one's true beliefs in the face of imminent persecution. But in modern Iran, it has evolved into a daily, mandatory performance.
How does it play out in daily life?
The first face is the public mask. This is the persona you wear the moment you step out of your front door. It is the careful adherence to the mandatory dress codes. It is the calculated silence when passing a morality police van.
Right.
It is the careful curation of your words at the grocery store or the university. This public face is purely a survival mechanism designed to navigate the constant scrutiny of the IRGC, the besieged, and the neighborhood informants.
But then you go home, you close the door, you pull the curtains, and the second face emerges.
Yes. The private face. Within the sanctuary of the home, the physical and metaphorical masks are removed. This is where families listen to forbidden music, where they discuss actual politics, where they consume international media via illegal satellite dishes, and where they authentically mourn the people they have lost.
It's a double life.
The tragedy is that deceit has literally been baked into the social contract. To be an honest citizen in public is to invite imprisonment or death. To be a survivor is to master the art of living a double life.
And when you force 93 million people to master the art of deception just to stay alive, That psychology doesn't just vanish because a missile strikes a building or a leader dies.
No, it lingers.
The instinct to hide, the instinct to assume the person next to you might be an informant becomes cellular. And that deep-seated paranoia, that absolute deficit of trust, brings us directly to the most critical, immediate problem facing Iran today, because right now, there is a massive power vacuum.
Yes, the vacuum is the biggest issue.
The top of the pyramid is gone. The regime is reeling. And the world is asking, who steps up? Who actually speaks for the Iranian people?
To answer that, we first have to discard the notion that Iran is a monolithic entity. It is not just one demographic or one unified political mind. Iran is a vast, ancient, and incredibly complex tapestry of differing ethnicities, languages, and cultural histories. The demographic map is incredibly diverse.
Walk us through that map, because I think a lot of people just assume everyone in Iran is simply Persian.
It's a common misconception. While the Fars population, primarily located in the central regions, forms the ethnic and linguistic core that we often associate with Persian culture, they're just one piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
In the rugged northwest, particularly in provinces near the borders of Turkey and Iraq, you have a massive Kurdish population. This is the region Assefa's family hails from, an area called Elam. The Kurds have their own distinct language, culture, and a long history of seeking autonomy.
And they aren't the only significant minority group?
Far from it. In the north, around the major city of Tabriz, you have a very large Azeri population who speak a Turkic language. In the south, particularly in the oil-rich province of Khuzestan near the Iraqi border, you have significant Arab populations.
There's so much variety.
You also have the Galakas near the Caspian Sea, the Lurs in the west, and the Balak people in the southeast near Pakistan. Managing a nation of 93 million people with such distinct regional identities requires either an incredibly inclusive democratic system or a highly centralized authoritarian grip.
And historically,
For the past century, under both the Shah and the clerics,
demographic complexity maps directly onto a deeply fractured, highly contentious political landscape. As this power vacuum opens up, there are multiple factions and opposition groups both inside the country and in the massive diaspora jockeying for position.
It's a crowded field.
It really is. We need to walk through who these contenders actually are. And again, to you listening, as a reminder, we are outlining these groups based strictly on the historical record and the source material provided, looking at the board impartially. Let's start with the group that probably has the highest visibility in the West, the monarchists.
The monarchist faction primarily advocates for the restoration of the Pahlavi dynasty. Their central figure is Reza Pahlavi, the eldest son of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, who was overthrown in the 1979 revolution.
He's very prominent right now.
Yes, Reza Pahlavi has lived in exile, primarily in the United States, for nearly 5 decades. From a public relations standpoint, he is highly visible. He regularly appears on international television broadcasts, meeting with Western lawmakers, and consistently projecting a message of readiness, essentially stating, I am here and I am prepared to lead a transition.
He definitely commands a significant following, particularly among older generations in the diaspora who remember the pre-1979 era with nostalgia. But the source material is very careful to point out that while he is popular in certain circles, the prospect of his return is deeply, deeply controversial inside Iran, specifically when you talk to the minority groups we just mapped out.
That's a key point.
Why is there such hesitation about bringing back the monarchy?
The hesitation is rooted in hard historical memory. While the current clerical system is authoritarian, the Shah's government prior to 1979 operated as an absolute monarchy.
Right.
While the Shah pushed for rapid modernization and secularization, often referred to as the White Revolution, he also maintained an iron grip on political dissent. The instrument of that control was SAVAK, the highly feared secret police and intelligence service.
SAVAK was brutal.
Yes, SAVAK was notorious for its brutal interrogation methods, widespread surveillance, and severe suppression of any political opposition, particularly leftists and regional autonomy movement.
Right, so if you are a Kurdish family in the Northwest, your historical experience with the Pahlavi dynasty wasn't about modernization, it was about suppression of your cultural identity.
Exactly. For the Kurdish population, and many other minority groups, the Pahlavi era was characterized by a forced centralization that actively suppressed their language and political rights.
So they're wary.
Very wary. So, when the monarchists propose a return to power, these minority groups do not necessarily view it as a path to democratic liberation. They view it with profound suspicion, fearing it simply represents trading a clerical dictatorship for a royal one.
Okay, that covers the monarchists. Now let's look at a group with a vastly different ideology and an incredibly dark history. The MEK, or the Mujahideen Khalq.
Yeah.
This is actually the group that Assafi's parents initially aligned with in the 1980s before they realized its direction and walked away.
A very complicated group.
The MEK is highly organized, they have massive lobbying power in Western capitals, but inside Iran, their reputation is deeply problematic. Why?
The history of the MPK is one of the most complex and tragic arcs in modern Iranian politics. In the years leading up to and immediately following the 1979 revolution, the MEK had a massive, genuine grassroots following inside Iran.
Because they opposed the Shah.
Right. They blended elements of Marxism with Islamic theology, which appealed to a large segment of the young, educated class fighting against the Shah. However, when the clerical establishment consolidated power in the early 1980s, they violently purged the MEK.
And then the MEK made a pivot.
In response, the leadership of the MEK made a strategic geopolitical decision that permanently altered their standing among the Iranian public.
This is regarding the Iran-Iraq War, correct?
Yes. The Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s was a devastating 8-year-long conflict that defined a generation, resulting in hundreds of thousands of Iranian casualties. As the MEK was being hunted inside Iran, their leadership fled and eventually established massive military bases, most notably Camp Ashraf inside Iraq. But they didn't just take refuge there. The MEK formally allied themselves with Saddam Hussein. They received Iraqi weapons, funding, and logistical support, and they actively fought alongside Iraqi forces against Iranian conscripts.
That is an astonishing calculation. You are essentially joining the invading army that is bombing your own cities. I cannot imagine how the average Iranian citizen, regardless of how much they hated the clerics, would view that.
It was viewed as the ultimate treason. For millions of Iranians who lost brothers, fathers, and sons defending their borders against Saddam Hussein, the MEK's alliance with Iraq was an unforgivable betrayal.
It's hard to come back from that.
Over the subsequent decades, the MEK has operated in exile, transitioning into an organization that many analysts describe as having deeply cult-like characteristics regarding their leadership structure.
Like a cult of personality.
Yes. They possess significant financial resources and frequently pay high-profile Western politicians to speak at their rallies. But their claim to represent a viable, popular democratic alternative is fundamentally hindered by that historical alliance with a foreign enemy.
So we have the monarchists and the MEK. Then you have a broad coalition of groups generally categorized as federalists or separatists. This is where the minority populations we discussed earlier really come into play.
Correct. When you look at groups representing the Kurds, the Azeris, or the Arab minorities, the central government in Tehran has historically painted them with a very broad, very dangerous brush.
How so?
The state media consistently labels them entirely as armed separatists, pushing the narrative that these groups want to violently carve Iran into distinct independent nations, thereby destroying the territorial integrity of the country.
But the source material, specifically Assafi's perspective as someone from a Kurdish family, argues that this separatist label is largely a deliberate mischaracterization designed to delegitimize them.
Yes. While fringe separatist elements undoubtedly exist, the vast majority of these regional political movements advocate for federalism, not separatism.
Like a state system.
They explicitly state that they do not want to destroy the borders of Iran. Instead, they want a decentralized system of governance, analogous to the federal model in Germany or the United States.
That makes a lot of sense.
Their demands are rooted in basic civil and cultural rights. They want the autonomy to manage their local economies, the right to teach their native languages in their own schools alongside Persian, and the right to celebrate their unique cultural heritage without state interference. They want to be Iranian, but they want to be Kurdish Iranian or Arab Iranian with equal legal standing.
And finally, rounding out the political spectrum, you have the leftists and the communist factions, most notably the historical remnants of the Tudeh Party.
The Tudeh Party was once a massive political force in Iran, particularly in the mid-20th century. Rooted in Marxist-Leninist ideology, they historically maintained strong ties to the Soviet Union and were highly influential among industrial workers and the intelligentsia.
But they were purged too, right?
Like the MEK, they were brutally purged by both the Shah and later the clerics. While their numerical strength today is diminished, leftist ideals focusing heavily on workers' rights, economic equality, and secularism still hold significant sway among certain segments of the student population and labor unions.
So you look at this board. You have monarchists wanting a return to a centralized royal past. You have the MEK with its deeply controversial military history. You have federalists demanding regional autonomy. And you have leftists demanding economic restructuring.
It's a very fragmented picture.
It is an incredibly crowded, ideologically opposed field. Now, logic would dictate that when faced with a common enemy, a deeply entrenched, heavily armed clerical state, these diaspora groups living safely in the West would find a way to build a unified coalition, but they haven't. And the reason why is one of the most disturbing elements of this entire story. The politics of the Iranian diaspora are incredibly, paralyzingly toxic.
The toxicity within the diaspora is not merely a byproduct of ideological disagreement. It is the result of a highly sophisticated, decades-long psychological operation conducted by the intelligence services in Tehran.
They engineered it.
The regime has essentially executed a masterclass in divide and conquer. They recognize that a unified opposition abroad, capable of lobbying Western governments with a single voice, represents a massive existential threat. Therefore, as the source points out, the intelligence apparatus actively plants spies and provocateurs within nearly every single opposition group operating in Europe and North America.
And the goal of those infiltrators isn't necessarily to assassinate people on the streets of Paris or London, although that has happened historically. The primary goal is just to sow absolute paranoia.
Precisely. The goal is to inject poison into the well of trust. If you are an activist sitting in a planning meeting in Berlin or Toronto, and you suspect that the person sitting across from you who is shouting the loudest against the regime might actually be an agent of the IRGC recording the meeting, you cannot build a coalition.
No, you looking over your shoulder.
You cannot share resources. You become consumed by internal witch hunts. The regime uses fake social media accounts, coordinated harassment campaigns, and deliberate misinformation to ensure that the monarchists despise the leftists, the federalists distrust the MEK, and everyone is isolated.
And this engineered hatred bleeds out into the real world in terrifying ways. Asifa shares a personal story that genuinely shocked me. She's a prominent voice advocating for a transitional democratic coalition.
A very reasonable stance.
Exactly. Her stance is very pragmatic. She argues that everyone, the Pahlavi supporters, the MEK, the Federalists, the leftists, needs to sit at a massive table and figure out a democratic transition. Because she holds this inclusive view and because she refuses to unconditionally pledge allegiance solely to the return of the Shah, she has been subjected to horrific, violently vulgar threats.
And it is critical to note the origin of those threats.
This is the crazy part.
She wasn't just being threatened by anonymous accounts aligned with the clerics in Tehran. She was receiving graphic threats of violence from extreme factions within the diaspora itself, specifically individuals claiming to be staunch monarchists.
Right.
The harassment escalated to a point where individuals were threatening to kidnap her young daughter in the Netherlands. She had to involve the Dutch police.
Just think about the profound tragedy of that. You have people who have fled an authoritarian system, living in free democratic countries in Europe, and they are using the tactics of terror against each other simply over disagreements about what a future hypothetical government should look like.
It illustrates how deeply the trauma of authoritarianism has infected the psychological framework of the opposition itself. When a society is governed by absolute intolerance for decades, elements of the opposition often internalize that same intolerance.
They become what they hate.
They replicate the authoritarian mindset, just with a different ideology.
And this inability to unite abroad brings us to a terrifying tactical crisis happening on the ground inside Iran right now, in the immediate shadow of these airstrikes. Because while the diaspora argues on social media, the actual credible leaders who could potentially unify the country are trapped. We need to talk about Evin Prison.
Yes.
If you follow international human rights, that name sends a chill down your spine.
Evin Prison, located in the foothills of northern Tehran, is infamous globally. It is the primary facility where the state incarcerates its political prisoners. It is not an exaggeration to say that Evin houses the brightest intellectual minds in Iran.
The best of the best.
It holds award-winning journalists, renowned filmmakers, student leaders, and internationally recognized human rights lawyers like Nasrin Sotoudeh. It holds the domestic leaders of the women's rights movements and the labor unions. It is essentially the brain trust of a future democratic Iran, currently locked in small, overcrowded cages.
And right now, Evin Prison is caught in the most horrifying dual dilemma imaginable. On one side, you have the internal threat. The leadership structure of the regime has just been decapitated by an airstrike.
Total chaos.
The IRGC and the security forces are likely in a state of absolute panic and extreme paranoia. There is a very real historical precedent to fear that the state, feeling cornered, might simply decide to execute these political prisoners en masse to ensure they can never serve as a rallying point for a new government.
It is the ultimate scorched earth tactic. If the system believes it is collapsing, the hardline elements may decide to eliminate the alternative leadership before they lose control of the facility. We saw exactly this kind of preemptive slaughter in 1988.
But on the other side of the coin, you have the external threat. There are advanced fighter jets dropping munitions on military and leadership targets in Tehran. Asifa notes in the interview that during previous escalations, explosions have occurred perilously close to the doors of Evin prison.
That's terrifying for the families.
And the fear is twofold. Will the West accidentally drop a bomb on the prison, mistaking it for a purely military compound? Or, in a much darker, more cynical geopolitical twist, could the destruction of that brain trust be viewed as convenient by foreign powers who want to install a compliant puppet leader rather than dealing with fiercely independent, homegrown, democratic leaders?
That anxiety highlights the profound distrust Iranians have toward external military intervention. In the interview, Asifa makes a very specific, desperate tactical plea.
What does she suggest?
She argues that if the United States or Israel or the West broadly truly intends to assist the Iranian people, rather than just settling geopolitical scores, dropping high-yield explosives from 30,000 feet is entirely the wrong approach.
You can't bomb your way to democracy.
You cannot precision bomb your way to a democratic transition. She calls for highly specialized, targeted operations, essentially special ops, designed specifically to breach these detention centers, secure the perimeters, and protect these imprisoned intellectuals before they are executed by fleeing guards or killed as collateral damage.
To save the brain trust.
Because if the gates of Evin are opened, and those leaders survive, they are the individuals possessing the actual grassroots legitimacy required to rebuild the civil society.
So if we look at the board as it stands right this second, we have a decapitated leadership, a vast and heavily armed IRGC that is still intact, a deeply traumatized and economically desperate population, a fractured opposition abroad, and bombs actively falling. What happens next? The source material lays out 3 distinct scenarios for how this massive power vacuum could ultimately play out. Let's walk through them.
The first scenario is frequently referred to as the Venezuela or Syria model. In this outcome, the targeted military actions by the U.S. and Israel succeed in their narrow objective, eliminating the supreme figureheads. Khamenei is gone. Perhaps a few top generals are eliminated, but the underlying massive machinery of the state remains fundamentally untouched.
Because, as you mentioned earlier, the IRGC isn't just a handful of guys at the top. It's a massive conglomerate with 150,000 armed soldiers controlling the ports, the internet, and the economy. You can't just evaporate that overnight.
Exactly. In this scenario, the IRGC regroups. They might elevate a new, perhaps slightly more pragmatic leader who is willing to quiet the international waters. They might even sign a new nuclear treaty with the West to get sanctions lifted, allowing money to flow back into their corporate holdings.
So they just rebrand.
The West declares a geopolitical victory because the immediate nuclear threat is neutralized. But for the Iranian people, absolutely nothing changes. The dictatorship remains, the surveillance remains, the economic monopolization remains. It is simply new management at the top of the exact same authoritarian structure.
So a geopolitical win for Washington and a total hollow tragedy for the people of Iran. That's scenario 1. What is the second scenario?
The second scenario is the nightmare of a massive, uncontained regional war. We have to remember that Iran is not a small, isolated nation that can simply implode quietly. It is a massive geopolitical anchor with immense natural wealth, vast reserves of oil and natural gas, as well as high-value resources like saffron and caviar.
It's a huge economy.
Over the past several decades, the state has utilized this wealth to cultivate a complex, highly armed network of proxy militias across the Middle East. We are talking about deep logistical and financial ties to Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, various militias in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen. Furthermore, Iran has solidified deep strategic and military partnerships with global powers like Russia and China.
So if the regime feels that its total collapse is imminent, they might not just quietly fade into history. They could trigger every single tripwire they've spent 40 years setting up.
Yes. A cornered, heavily armed apparatus could lash out aggressively, utilizing its remaining missile stockpiles and drone capabilities to strike vital infrastructure in neighboring Western-aligned countries.
Taking everyone down with them.
They could target energy facilities in Saudi Arabia, shipping lanes near Qatar and Bahrain, or military installations across the Gulf. The objective would be to ignite the entire region, turning a domestic collapse into a chaotic, multi-front international conflict, drawing regional neighbors and global superpowers into a massive, devastating war.
That is the powder keg scenario. But then, amidst all this darkness, there is the third scenario. The outcome that activists like Asefa have dedicated their lives to fighting for the democratic dream.
The third scenario envisions a managed, inclusive transition of power. Drawing inspiration from European models, such as the Dutch parliamentary system, the concept is to establish a massive, highly inclusive transitional coalition.
A big tent.
The fundamental principle is that no single faction gets to declare victory or assume total control. Instead, you build a table large enough for everyone. The monarchists are given a seat, the MEK is given a seat, the leftists are given a seat, the federalists representing the Kurds, the Azeris, the Arabs are all given seats. The surviving intellectuals from Evin prison sit at the head of that table.
And the sole purpose of this temporary coalition wouldn't be to rule indefinitely, but just to stabilize the country long enough to organize something Iran hasn't seen in decades.
Precisely. Their mandate would be strictly limited to maintaining civic order, drafting a new secular constitution that guarantees human and minority rights, and preparing the logistical groundwork for internationally observed, free, and fair elections.
Elections.
It is the arduous, complicated process of allowing 93 million people to finally walk into a voting booth and peacefully determine their own collective destiny.
But getting all of those factions to sit down at that table, especially given the toxicity we discussed, requires an immense amount of trust. And it also requires navigating a massive mountain of historical baggage, particularly regarding the role of Western nations.
This raises an important question, and it is a theme heavily emphasized in the source material. You absolutely cannot analyze the sight of American or Israeli munitions striking targets in Tehran today without contextualizing it within a very long, very dark history of Western intervention in the Middle East.
Right.
The historical memory in Iran is long, and it is deeply skeptical of foreign powers claiming to bring liberation.
The source goes all the way back to the early 20th century to explain this, specifically citing the 1917 Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Sykes-Picot is essentially the foundational trauma of the modern Middle East. During World War I, diplomats from the British and French empires met in secret and essentially took a ruler to a map of the declining Ottoman Empire.
Drawing lines in the sand.
They carved the region into arbitrary spheres of influence, drawing artificial borders that completely ignored the deeply rooted ethnic, linguistic, and religious realities on the ground. They grouped rival factions together and split cohesive communities apart, laying the geographical groundwork for a century of structural instability and conflict.
Well, you talk specifically about the relationship between Iran and the United States. There is one year, one specific event that serves as the absolute original sin, and that is 1953. I want to spend some real time on this, because if you don't understand 1953, you cannot understand why Iranians might look at a U.S. airstrike today with deep, deep suspicion, even if they hate the target.
The events of 1953 are paramount. In the early 1950s, Iran was navigating a fragile but functioning democratic process. They had a democratically elected prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh.
He was very popular, right?
Extremely. Mossadegh was a highly popular secular nationalist, and his primary political objective was to address a massive economic grievance. Iran's vast oil reserves were entirely controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British entity that essentially funneled the wealth of Iran's natural resources back to London, leaving the Iranian people in poverty.
So Mossadegh did what any nationalist leader would do. He passed legislation to nationalize the oil industry. He said, this oil belongs to Iran, and the profits should build Iranian schools and hospitals, not British empires.
Exactly. And the British response was severe.
Yeah.
They implemented a global embargo on Iranian oil, crippling the Iranian economy. But they went further. Recognizing they could not overthrow Mossadegh alone, the British intelligence service, MI6, approached the American CIA.
And this is right at the start of the Cold War.
Now, the geopolitical context here is the dawn of the Cold War. The British convinced the Eisenhower administration that Mossadegh's nationalist policies were making Iran vulnerable to Soviet communist influence.
And that was the trigger for Operation Ajax.
Yes. The CIA, operating out of the basement of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, orchestrated a highly coordinated coup d'etat. They funneled massive amounts of cash to bribe military officers, politicians, and street gangs to incite manufactured riots and chaos in Tehran.
So they basically bought a revolution.
The military eventually moved against Mossadegh, arresting the democratically elected prime minister. In his place, the U.S. and Britain consolidated absolute power in the hands of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
And he ruled for decades.
For the next 25 years, the Shah ruled as an autocrat, heavily backed by American military and financial support, ensuring Western access to Iranian oil while utilizing the Savak secret police to crush domestic dissent.
So let's connect that history to the present moment. When an Iranian citizen today looks up at the sky and sees an American-made bomb falling on Tehran, even if that bomb is hitting an IRGC headquarters, a system they desperately want removed, they aren't viewing it as a benevolent act of liberation. They are viewing it through the lens of 1953.
Precisely.
They are seeing foreign powers, once again, violently intervening to treat their country like a piece on a geopolitical chessboard.
It creates a profound, historically justified distrust. It reinforces the belief that Western actions in the region are ultimately driven by resource control and strategic positioning rather than a genuine desire for Iranian democratic sovereignty.
It's all about interests.
And it underscores a critical reality. Any sustainable, legitimate government that emerges from this current chaos must be organically built from within Iran by Iranians. If a new leader is perceived as being installed by or beholden to Washington or Tel Aviv, they will instantly lack the domestic legitimacy required to govern a fiercely proud, independent nation.
As we bring this deep dive toward a close, I want to fundamentally shift the tone of our conversation. We've spent the last hour dissecting heavy, dark topics. We've talked about hyperinflation, mass casualties, geopolitical proxy wars, and decades of state-sponsored trauma.
It's a lot to process.
It is. But the Source interview does something incredibly important at the end. It reminds us that Iran is not its regime. Iran is not its government. It is a nation with a profoundly rich, beautiful soul.
That distinction is vital. When we discuss international relations, it is easy to reduce a nation to the actions of its leadership. But Asifeh speaks to the enduring, resilient cultural heart of her homeland.
I love what she says about wanting to invite everyone.
She shares a vision that once the political infrastructure of oppression is finally dismantled, she wants to invite everyone from the Netherlands, from across Europe, from America to travel to Iran. She wants the world to experience the profound beauty and hospitality that has been hidden behind the curtain of dictatorship for half a century.
She talks passionately about the cultural and geographical treasures. This is one of the oldest, most poetically rich civilizations on Earth. It is the land of Hafiz and Rumi, poets whose works have explored the depths of human love and spirituality for centuries.
The literature is incredible.
And it is a geographical marvel. She describes a country so vast and diverse that in the exact same season, you can be skiing in the snow-capped Alborz Mountains in the north and a few hours later swimming in the warm waters of the Persian Gulf in the south.
And beyond the physical and historical beauty, she highlights the incredible, defiant contemporary culture, specifically the music of the resistance. Art has always been a primary vehicle for truth under authoritarianism.
Like Toumaj.
She mentions Toumaj Salehi, a fiercely courageous dissident rapper. Toumaj didn't flee. He stayed in Iran, writing incredibly potent lyrics that directly indicted the systemic corruption and brutality. For simply singing truth to power, he has faced severe physical abuse, solitary confinement, and the looming threat of state execution.
And she mentions Shervin Hajipour, a young musician who took the raw, heartbreaking tweets of ordinary Iranians explaining why they were protesting and turned them into the song Barai.
That song was everywhere.
That song wasn't just a hit. It became the undisputed global anthem of the 2022 protests, winning a Grammy for social change.
And perhaps the most poignant image she leaves us with from the source material occurs in the immediate, uncertain days following these recent airstrikes. Amidst the chaos, the panic, and the looming threat of war, footage emerged of the Kurdish people.
Yeah.
They were out in the streets of their cities. But they weren't burning things. They weren't shouting slogans of vengeance. They were holding hands and singing. They were singing traditional songs, asking for a peaceful dawn, asking for the freedom of their children. That collective voice, rising above the geopolitical noise, is the true soul of a country fighting desperately to breathe.
That image of people singing in the face of uncertainty is so powerful. But it also brings us back to the psychological reality we discussed earlier and leaves us with a massive question about what happens the morning after the smoke clears.
We spent significant time unpacking the sociological adaptation of the two faces, the public mask of compliance and the private face of truth. And this leaves us with a final vital thought for you to consider as you watch this historical moment unfold.
Right.
If the current system completely collapses overnight, if the supreme leadership is truly gone and a transition begins, how long does it take for a society of 93 million people to fundamentally unlearn the instinct to hide.
That is the real challenge, isn't it?
It is the ultimate challenge of rebuilding. How do you construct a trusting, transparent, functional democracy when for almost 50 consecutive years, trusting your neighbor, trusting your colleague at work, or trusting a stranger on the street could have literally resulted in your imprisonment or death? The physical walls of Evin Prison can be breached, and the political leadership can be removed by force. But the invisible psychological walls, constructed by half a century of systemic terror, will take generations of careful, dedicated work to dismantle.
That is a deeply profound, heavy question to sit with, and it changes the way you look at the news alert scrolling across your screen. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly extensive deep dive. Understanding these layers, the history, the factions, the economics, and the human psychology, is exactly how we move past the superficial headlines and actually make sense of a chaotic world. Keep exploring the history, keep asking the hard questions, and above all, stay curious. We will catch you on the next deep dive.